From Microbe TV, this is TWiN, This Week in Neuroscience, episode number 54, recorded on September 9th, 2024. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast about the nervous system. Joining me today from Salt Lake City, Jason Shepard.
Hey, Vincent. Good to see you. Hey, Vivian.
Hey.
It's been a while. We skipped August, so it's been some time. And also joining us from somewhere in New Orleans, Vivian Morrison.
On the Tulane campus again.
Okay. Good to see you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
For
Well,
as long as I'll be here, because it may not be on anyone else's radar, but we're all waiting for Tropical Storm Francine to develop into a hurricane and to land in southwest Louisiana. So we're still in New Orleans is still in the cone of uncertainty. But it should just be category 1. But we're all still, aflutter making preparations for if mice need to be evacuated or things like that. So,
well, we'll get through today's podcast, right?
Yes. It's not forecast to hit until a few days from now. But of course, I would be here regardless.
Speaking of podcasts, if you enjoy these discussions of science, we'd love to have your support. To do them, you can go to microbe.tv/contribute. Microbe TV is a 501(c) nonprofit, which means in the U.S., your donations would be federal U.S. tax deductible. So last time, that was back in July, we talked about freezing the brain to study it. And now we're going to look at the brain again, but in a different context, Vivian.
Yes, very, very different context. And one that is particularly relevant to me because in 2 weeks, I will be welcoming another little human into our family. So
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Congrats.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a long road, but the topic that we're going to be talking about today is how pregnancy changes your brain and prepares you for parenthood. And we're going to be focusing on females, obviously, because they're the ones carrying the fetus. But in the first piece, we're going to talk about, they do mention that there are changes that occur in the brains of fathers. To what extent those are the same kinds of changes that occur in the female brain, I don't know. I didn't dig that deeply, but it is, I think, readily accepted by the community who studies this topic that just kind of through observation and proximity and kind of repetitive exposure to parenting, there can be changes in the brain. Ones that are not nearly as robust as those that are seen in the actual in the mother during gestation, but that are still quite relevant. So we're going to split this episode up kind of roughly into 3 pieces, and each piece is associated with a particular article. And the first is a news feature piece that was written by Liam Drew in August of 2024, and in Nature, and it's entitled "How Pregnancy Changes the Brain." And not that anyone on this, not that any of my hosts have personally experienced this, but I think a lot of people know of the phenomenon of pregnancy brain, but it's maybe not what you thought it was. So I think it's interesting to think about what is, when you're, experiencing all these changes throughout your pregnancy, what is actually happening in your brain. And kind of surprisingly, the big finding is that the brain volume in the mothers actually reduces. So on average, it will get smaller by about 2%, but could be as much as 5%. Some of those changes reverse rapidly after giving birth, while others are more sustained for a longer period of time. Um, and people tend to think about, if you think about brain volume reduction, that just doesn't sound good, right? If you know anything about Alzheimer's disease, you know that, and I'm sure, and many other neurodegenerative disorders, you know that brain volume decreases. So, like, the nice, squishy, full human brain with all its folds, those folds start to get smaller, and you have these like big kind of cavernous trenches between the folds. I'm not saying that is quite what's happening in in a pregnant brain, but anyway, the point is that we tend to think about those kind of reductions as being a deficit or something bad, neurodegenerative, but there's no evidence for that in this situation. Um, and in fact, it's actually probably better to think about it as a reflection of neuroplasticity, because the same kind of thinning of the cortex, the outer part of your brain, also occurs during adolescence. And there's some similarities between pregnancy and adolescence. There are huge hormonal changes that are happening, and a lot of changes that are occurring in the brain in terms of how different brain regions talk to each other. So it's like where pregnancy is opening up these periods of adult neuroplasticity. Um, so in this news feature piece, um, it's introducing this idea that there's a reduction in brain volume in pregnant women, and it's actually that there are certain pathways, certain connections that are being reinforced, while others are, that are not going to be as important for parenting and preparing for the arrival of the child. Those things are being um, removed or kind of pulled out of circulation, if you will. Um, and it makes total sense, but these changes are highly correlated with the hormonal fluctuations that occur during pregnancy. And in one of the later pieces we will be going through, which is an, one part of it is an anatomical or MRI study in women. They show that it's that third trimester, those hormones, there's like a massive increase of estradiol that correlates the most strongly with the anatomical and also functional changes that they see. Um, and one of the other pieces that we're going to be going through actually takes it from the human into the mouse model, into a mouse model to see like, well, what's happening at the level of the cells. Um, and obviously there are lots of questions that they could ask. But you can't ask all questions at once. So they're going to focus on the roles of these hormones. Like, how do these fluctuations in hormones influence how the neurons work? And then we can kind of think about like how those changes in neuron function contribute to the kind of like broader connectivity and network changes that are observed in humans. Um, and then the behaviors that are observed in humans as well as in rodents. Um,
Some of this makes sense. Like I guess when as I said, when none of us know. Well, Vince and I don't know what it feels like, but like evolutionary, from an evolutionary perspective, you would expect that there's changes in behavior that associate with caregiving and looking after young,
Yeah.
and that's species specific, and hormones play a role in this. I guess the question is what so those would be beneficial, but are there, and can you tease out what's sort of a byproduct of being pregnant? What are the adverse sort of processes that may happen? Because you think about like having the pregnancy itself is sort of almost like having a foreign body, and there's immune
it
responses, and
is.
there's all these other things that happen.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, because even to, um, like you mentioned, during pregnancy, your immune system, the way it functions changes, because there's this constant battle between the fetus and the mother. And if, for example, the mother gets sick, there's this kind of decision that has to take place about like, do you launch a full scale attack, knowing that that could harm the fetus, or some of the like placental tissue or things like that. So it's definitely presents, there's two sides to this coin. And then even if you look after birth, everybody knows that there are very few unicorn babies out there. I think most parents of newborns experience like extreme sleep deprivation,
Hmm.
and we know that that's not good for your brain either.
Yeah.
So I think it would be interesting to kind of interpret the postpartum period brain changes in context of the sleep deprivation.
Yeah. I mean, and postpartum depression is pretty common too, right?
Right. And it's actually mentioned in this first piece, I believe, that um, as you mentioned, the immunological changes and then these psychosocial, psycho-emotional changes look a lot like, or they have a lot of kind of similarities with depression. Um, and, just to again link it back to kind of what's happening in the adolescent brain, that's a time when we often see mental health disorders emerge. And so again, kind of pointing at like that there's these underlying processes, happening at the cellular level, circuit level, that then manifest in behaviors. And I think it's interesting to think about like how we experience these changes, and we'll get to talking a little bit more about that later. But um, the one of the most interesting things for me, and this is kind of funny because it's not at all what I study. I rarely think about this, but the reduction in brain volume in pregnant women occurs in more robustly in certain parts of the brain. Um, and I'll go through what those are in the second piece. Not that the names are necessarily going to mean a lot to most of us, even for me. Um, I don't spend all of my time thinking about the precuneus and the medial prefrontal cortex and all of that. But these regions of the brain are involved in something, they constitute nodes in something that's called the default mode network. And the name default mode network comes from the kind of like default state of activity state that your brain takes on when you're not doing anything. So if you are just quietly awake, not thinking about anything in particular, or if you're just, watching the world happening around you, these nodes of the brain in the default mode network are activated. And there's
And
this
I know this is sort of uh, uh, one way we can dispel some myths about the brain, like the fact that, you know, people sort of think that if you're sitting there doing nothing, that your brain is doing nothing, when your brain's actually always on. And this idea that you only use 10% of your brain is obviously completely wrong, because your brain's always active. There's always stuff going on.
Yeah, totally. So the default mode network was something I'd kind of like heard, I was like, I kind of heard of this, and it's like, oscillations and stuff. But of course, when I read it, there's this fantastic review that I honestly am only partway through. But it's by I'm sure I'm mispronouncing this, Vinod Menon from Stanford. I don't know if anybody here knows, but it's this. It was published in Neuron in August 2023, and it's entitled 20 Years of the Default Mode Network, a Review and Synthesis. And this guy was actually one of the guys who really helped characterize the default mode network. Um, and so there's five things I think that he says is kind of like we consider the default mode network to be involved in. um self Let's see, where is it? He's like self-referential thinking, self-judgment, uh memory, language, semantic representations, and mind wandering. And I thought, we've talked a lot on this podcast about attention deficits and attention hyperactivity disorder, and um, and you guys have heard me talk about, have ADD. And so I was I was the child who's staring out the window all the time, just focused on, or, not being able to draw selective attention toward something that was considered salient by teachers or, family. So I thought it also is very interesting to think about how I know that there's a lot of research out there on the default mode network and how it's functions differently or is dysfunctional in Alzheimer's disease, neurodegenerative disorders, but also neurodevelopmental disorders like autism and ADD. Um, so um, the so the these regions of the brain that are experiencing the largest reduction in volume, which I'll get to later, are nodes in this default mode network. And but then how does that translate into behavior? It's kind of one of the questions that comes up, like how does that change the experience of the pregnant woman? How does that play into what needs to happen, like the preparations that need to happen before the baby arrives? Um, and the MRI paper that we're going to talk about, they look at a number of things, but they find that um, it's this kind of the degree of bonding between the mother and the infant is highly correlated with the strength of these changes in the default mode network. And that it, the flip side of it is that if these changes are not robust, then that's correlated with impairments in bonding. But it's a little bit, it's a little bit hand wavy for me because the default mode network, according to what I've read just recently, um, is involved in kind of understanding kind of where you end and somebody else begins kind of thing. Like, understanding your own internal narrative and then predicting or understanding those narratives and behaviors in others.
Yeah, I think I remember reading something about that. It's also involved in replaying. It's associated with thought. Like it's not just that you're sitting there and your mind is blank. It's that you're sort of replaying things in your head, or you're um, looking into the future. And so this is sort
Right.
of something that the hippocampus is known to do as well. But
Right. And they mentioned the hippocampus is one of those regions that has a volume reduction um, during pregnancy. Although interestingly, that particular region seems to bounce back pretty quickly after birth. Um, so again, I like to think about like, well, what's happening to the cells there? And when we're going to talk about a paper that's done with rodents, they specifically talk about changes in spine density and synapses. So it's kind of cool to think about that happening in your own brain. Um, okay.
wasn't there something about, didn't we cover at some point like that runners, the marathon runners also have shrinkage of the brain acutely?
But is that from like uh massive dehydration or
Dehydration.
Yeah, I
something?
know.
Yeah.
It's just that
I don't remember
because
that.
I just remember it being quite a dramatic change. And
That I also I thought about that when I was reading these papers because so I've this will be my third child and everybody's every child is different, as they say. Um but every pregnancy has had kind of these themes, and the theme of this particular pregnancy was dehydration. It's like stay hydrated. And so I
oh,
was like,
isn't that
well,
because you're in New Orleans?
no. I mean, actually, you know what? There is an increased risk of like kidney stones um, in this part of the world because it's so hot, and you
Oh,
just can't really keep up with how much water you need to be taking in. Um, but I thought about, well, you have all these like changes in hemodynamics, and we know
Mm.
that like the kind of extracellular fluid in the brain compartment kind of fluid moves from like the kind of vascular input through the brain tissue and then back out through venous systems. And so I was like, well, how does I'm have like, quadrupled my blood volume. How does that influence,
Yeah. Hmm.
what's going on in the brain? And, but the MRI paper, um, did, did like I don't know exactly like how they measured this. I think it was in urine, potentially. It was osmolality. Um, and they found that there was no association between the brain volume changes and any kind of peripheral changes in ion balance.
Right.
Um, I like that paper brings up, they're like, here are some limitations. We're doing this in humans. So there are a lot of things that we can't ask, but on the flip side, there are things that they are things that we can ask in mice, but then, we can't ask the mouse, how it's self-referential thinking is, and how it feels, how much pleasure is it taking from interacting with its offspring, so I guess that's why you got to have them, both approaches. um so the final thing that they bring up in this news feature, this first piece that we're talking about, that I thought was very interesting, was that uh my husband and I joke about how, like, these children are just taking years off of our life, like with the sleep deprivation and, like, just constantly being infected by some pathogen because children are walking biohazards. Um, Incidentally, the laboratory that I'm now working in is actually studying the role of repeated viral infections on brain aging. So
Hmm.
hopefully I'll have more to talk about on that front in a future episode. But um, there's a researcher at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, which is one of the institutions at which I studied. So that's always kind of cool to see these little Swiss Easter eggs popping up. This researcher asked whether the kind of like uh, she has a brain age score, and I don't know what's involved in that specifically, but she wanted to see how that varies as a function of how many children the woman has had.
Hmm.
And on average, the mother's brains were about 7 months younger than those without children. So it kind of gets me back. It reminds me of the comment that you had earlier, Jason, about, like, what are the downsides? What are the other things that are happening? Because we know that, like, there's a complicated relationship between estrogens and brain aging. Um, and there's a higher, rate of Alzheimer's disease in females, for example. And but maybe the upside is that somehow, and it might not be through the mechanisms that they're discussing here, but somehow having children keeps you young, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but I would caution anyone. Uh, well, I would say we just don't understand what that means yet, like, at all, because as they mention in this paper, like, we are not mice, and everything that happens around pregnancy, and parenthood, is, like, deeply entangled with, like, society and the other people in our lives. And um so there's a lot that can be happening, um beyond our hormonal fluctuations, that are going to be, bringing about um these changes. um so now I want to move on to the second piece. This is a Nature Communications paper, published in late 2022. And this is an MRI paper, and so the title is "Mapping the Effects of Pregnancy on Resting State Brain Activity." So that's referencing the default mode network. White matter microstructure. So white matter are all the kind of like it's all the myelinated regions, or like insulated regions. It's basically like the information highway. So we have these like bundles of axons, so that take information from a cell body in one part of the brain, and transmit that information to other neurons in other parts of the brain. And then they also looked at neural metabolite concentrations and gray matter architecture. So the gray matter is the component of the part of the brain that is filled mostly with synapses and other cell types that are involved in mediating what's happening at the synapse, whereas the white matter is, like I said, this kind of like axon bundles. Spoiler alert, there were no significant differences in terms of white matter structure in pregnant women during the postpart or during gestation and in the postpartum period. This is not terribly surprising to me. Um, we see big changes in white matter when, for example, you're learning how to juggle or ride a unicycle or, perform any other, circus related hobbies. Just basically a lot of like motor learning. But since we're not really doing a whole lot of that during pregnancy, I'm not, or even afterwards, I'm not surprised. So this is more about like these kind of fine tuning changes that are happening at the level of the synaptic connections. And also, this was a little surprising to me. There also were no real significant differences in terms of neural metabolites. I don't know why why that surprises me. But it does. Maybe I'll come up with some explanation for why that gave me pause. But it essentially comes down to that gray matter architecture, gray matter volume, and then how the default mode network functions. So the design is pretty simple. They had a handful of women, a bunch of women. I think it was 40 or so women who were pregnant and 40 who were not pregnant. And they had some sessions, some imaging sessions, and collection of various samples that happened before pregnancy, late pregnancy, post pregnancy, and then 1 year after giving birth. And they are able to, they're not comparing like they're able to compare the brain changes that are happening in a person, in these women, to their own baseline. So they're able to correct for things like just differences in brain volume, brain size at baseline, since we all have different sized heads, for example. So I told you earlier that I was gonna give you some names of the places that are affected by these gray matter volume reductions. So we have bilateral superior temporal sulcus, temporoparietal junction, and then anterior and posterior. So like anterior and posterior midline or medial regions of the brain. Those the most like involved clusters that were most, or regions that were most involved, were the precuneus and the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. Based on the reading I've done in that great review I was mentioning, it seems like the prefrontal cortex as well as the lateral frontal areas are what's involved in kind of like turning on or turning off the default mode network. So when you're asked to do a task, for example, so this is actually how they discovered the default mode network. They noticed that there were brain regions that suddenly became inactive, or like the activity in those areas went down when somebody was performing a task, which was kind of surprising because, I think you would just think about like, I'm going to ask this person to do a task and then I'm going to see certain areas get turned on. But areas were already turned on, like Jason said earlier, like we're always doing something. And so it was really that there were these nodes that kind of disappeared off of those maps of activity. And it seems like the medial prefrontal cortex and some of these lateral regions involve kind of being like, okay, it's time to turn it on or turn it off, suppress the default mode network or activate it. So those are some of the brain regions that were most heavily involved. And so you guys can,
Do they speculate why this would be? Like, why would you want to modulate the default network specifically? Or is there any use to that?
I think so. One of the things that they talk about in terms of behavior, they talk about bonding and kind of the emotional aspect of the mother infant dyad, but they also talk about nesting behavior, which I think again is one of those things. It's like pregnancy brain. People are like, oh, nesting. You're like setting up the nursery and folding little socks and things like that. Preparing, and uh, so it appears that like um, there are aspects of nesting that are correlated more tightly with like the nesting behaviors that are correlated with default mode network enhancement. And that probably I'm guessing, and they didn't say it like this, but I'm guessing, and this is also from my personal experience, the amount of time that you spend imagining what the future is going to be like with the baby, that's something that was always very prominent in my experience anyway with the
Mm.
3 kids. And in fact, with the second one, um with the second child, we didn't find out the sex until he was born. um and I actually found that was kind of hindered my ability in some way to imagine to like place myself in a situation like I'm holding my infant son. Like I think about it all the time now. I know what the sex of this child is. It's a boy. And I did with my first child. And so having just that extra information allowed me to go that much deeper, excuse me, in imagining what the situation would be like,
Mm.
planning for the future, which is something, Jason, that you mentioned earlier as being like a known function of the default mode network.
Yeah.
So potentially it has something to do with that. I'd love to learn a little bit more. This is mentioned in both the first and the first piece and this MRI paper, that this kind of differentiation between, or like, the mother's ability to see the child as a separate entity, to differentiate themselves from the child and the fetus and then the baby, that ability to differentiate was stronger when the kind of like overall functioning or enhancement of the default mode network was higher.
Hmm.
So, but I still think that doesn't really answer your question about like, well, why would that be beneficial? I might almost think that it would be like not beneficial.
Yeah.
So that I'm not clear on. And that was I even put a question mark next to the section of this MRI paper where it said that, where I was like, I don't really understand why. I mean, as the child ages and you want to give them more like independence, I can see how that would fit there, but but I'm not sure. And even the nesting behavior seems a little like, if you're a rodent, you got to build a nest, you know?
Yeah, and those are innate behaviors. At least in rodents, they know how to do that. It's not like they learn how to do that.
Yeah, I mean, they don't have to go on to, I mean, Babies R Us is not a thing anymore, but, they don't have to go on Wayfair and look for like the perfect crib and be like, oh, is there a little, elbow or knee going to get stuck between the slats? And, it's again, being a human, pregnant human, has a lot more, non-innate stuff going on. So anyway, this MRI paper basically is like, hey, we got these reductions in gray matter volume, and they're really happening in areas that are big nodes in default mode network. And when they take it to, they did some, I should mention that they did a good job talking about the limitations of their study, and they were very, what's the word? Like thorough in choosing and having controls and trying to like tweeze out certain potential confounding variables. So they looked at, if the pregnancy was a result of a fertility treatment, whether it was a singleton or twins. that were born, and also any medical history that might be relevant. There were no associations there. Later, they also looked at things like I mentioned, osmolality, stress. I didn't look into the survey that they used to assess stress. I think, if you have severe trauma, that's going to be a lot different than, they didn't have the kind of kombucha that I wanted at Whole Foods that I have been craving. That's I didn't look at that, but also sleep. They looked at those, and there were no strong correlations between any of those. Sleep, stress, osmolality, the duration of postpartum factors, the type of delivery. Um, they're the only thing that they did find a significant, that did play some role, was in the postpartum period, and it was the length of breastfeeding. Which again, they said that the prolonged breastfeeding might play a role in stimulating the maintenance of these neural changes. But that also was, I put a question mark there because I didn't understand their wording. They were talking about there being a positive correlation between the degree of breastfeeding or prolonged breastfeeding and the reversal of DMN, the default mode network coherence, so like connectivity. So I didn't understand that. Seemed like a contradiction, but that could just be that, I don't study. This is not my forte, so perhaps it's just a kind of semantic or linguistic thing that
I
I'm
think maybe
missing.
they're just saying, like, I mean, I also not expert here, but I assume that if you're breastfeeding for longer, that some of the hormonal, uh,
Like
changes that are
prolactin.
important for keeping breast milk, whatever, going
Hmm.
could also influence the brain.
Yeah, and actually, in the third paper, which we'll get to shortly, they do mention that, there's a host. The third paper that's in rodents, it looks at estrogen and progesterone, which are like the two like heavy hitters. But we also know that there's like oxytocin and prolactin.
Yeah.
Just by the name prolactin, you can guess that has to do with lactation. Um, and it's associated with like dopamine, or like works against, uh, um, sort of an opposition. All right, it's influences of dopaminergic circuits. So they say like, we're not studying that here. However, these studies need to be done. Like, they find some very interesting things just by modulating estrogen and progesterone receptors in the mice. But then future studies will need to be done to take into account like the contribution of these other hormones. I want to dive in a little bit, just emphasize a little bit more the behavioral aspect of this MRI study. Like, what were the things that they looked at? They looked at maternal fetal attachment, physiological reactions to infant cues, and nesting behavior. And we talked a little bit about the fetal attachment, or the attachment and bonding between the mother and the child. We also talked a little bit about the nesting behavior. Um, but I think an important one to mention is this physiological reaction to infant cues, because it's relevant to the next paper in mice. It's one of the things that it's really cool, I think. But basically, they did, the kinds of tests that you can do non-invasively in humans. So like measuring like physiological measures like heart rate, and sweating on the skin, or like conductance of the skin. And they found that there was a correlation between this enhancement of the default mode network, so by extension, gray matter volume changes, and a reduction in heart rate when when the women were watching videos of laughing babies, or babies. Um, and they mention in there, in the paper, that this reduction in heart rate is like well known to be associated with like turning attention towards a salient stimulus, which was news to me because I don't typically do this kind of work. But that's kind of like a harbinger of what's to come in the next paper, which is that like there are changes happening to the neurons that make them very sensitive to a particular set of cues, ones that are associated with your progeny. And any parent, male or female, probably mostly females, who carried the baby, will, I think, be like, yes, I know what that feels like. It is painful to hear your child cry. And also you develop like the hearing of a bat. You're like, oh, did the baby make any noise? So I think that I'm like, okay, this kind of aligns with the experience, you know. So these changes actually, so they can last for up to a year, maybe 2 years after birth. So it's interesting to think about how these things might, and if you have 2 pregnancies back to back, are they compounded? I don't know. Guess we'll see. So unless anybody else has anything else to say about the MRI study, I want to jump into the mouse study. Because I think there's some like that. What was exciting to me about doing an episode on this was that there are studies in humans, and I can link that to this study in mice, and kind of give us all a little nugget of information about what's happening, what's actually like going from behavior and brain imaging to like what is happening in the neurons. So and also what's interesting is that I mentioned earlier that there are brain changes that happen in fathers as well, even though they're not undergoing the same kinds of hormonal fluctuations as the pregnant mother. But there's a similar kind of thing happening in rodents, where if the if virgin females are exposed to pups, they start to develop these maternal or parenting behaviors, not as strongly as when they actually are, for example, injected with the pregnancy reproductive hormones. If you inject a virgin female with reproductive hormones, you can pretty much recapitulate what she would be what a actually pregnant dam would be doing. But even just kind of being around that and being exposed to that kind of behavior can have changes, which I think is interesting. And again, another parallel between humans and rodents. So this paper, this was published October 2023. And in Science, hormone-mediated neural remodeling orchestrates parenting onset during pregnancy. And the parenting onset part, you're like, huh, what does that mean? Like, you're not parenting until the baby's out, right? Well, actually, no. There are changes already occurring mid-gestation, and there are these like nesting behaviors, like how much do you return to the nest, how much fluffing up of your little, the tissues and stuff, paper that we put in the cages, do they do? And then that leads into the postpartum behaviors, where you're seeking out the pups and
that also makes sense. Like,
bringing them
I mean,
back.
I know in humans it's all muddied because we have all these cultural and societal things. But if you look at other animals, I mean, there's some extreme behaviors. Like some birds will sit on their eggs for the whole duration, right? That's a big change in behavior, stuff like that.
Yeah. No, that's true. I didn't even think about that. And aren't there some species where it's like actually that those are egg, not placentals. So I was
Yeah,
like,
right.
huh, because isn't it like the male penguins, for example, are the ones that like sit on the, but I don't know that's definitely a rabbit hole that we're not going to go down. But that's a very interesting question, a very interesting thought. But yeah, can have these so it's very, to your point, yes, these behaviors are very stark in rodents.
Yeah.
Less clear in humans. But this works to our advantage when using rodents, is because like we know what we should be looking for, and then it means that we can quantify it, like how long did it take them to go retrieve their pups. Like if we move the pups out of the nest and put them on the other side of the cage, how much time did it take the mother to like go seek them out and bring them back, and then how much time does she spend grooming them afterwards, and does she crouch, how often is she crouching to allow the pups to latch on and start nursing. But these behaviors actually start already appearing. So mouse gestation is about like 18 days, and so even at day 10 of gestation, you already see these changes, and they are happening. They will happen in pregnant moms. They will also happen in virgin females that have repetitive exposure to the pups, which is also interesting because it brings up like questions about what role do whatever, whatever signals the pups are putting off. Like those are probably having some influence on these females. So they're still going to be sensitive to something that's being produced by. So that's another like element that at some point probably will have to come into these kinds of studies. On the other hand, and it does have something to do with hormone, with like the reproductive hormones, because if you try doing the same thing with animals, with females that have had the ovaries removed, so they're not able to produce the reproductive hormones, you don't see any of this behavior happening, whether they're exposed repeatedly to pups or not. So they do this kind of like figuring out when certain behaviors happen and to what extent. And they need to do that because now they're going to zero in on a particular part of the brain that previous literature suggests is important for parenting behaviors in at least in mice. And they're gonna, and they figure out like, okay, so the region is the medial preoptic area. It's critical for parenting behavior, and there's about 20% of the neurons in this area co-express an estrogen receptor and a progesterone receptor. Now they make an interesting there's an interesting side note in the discussion, which is that there are neurons in this area, generally speaking, that co-express the estrogen and progesterone receptors, but they are not involved. For some reason, those neurons are not involved in any of the parenting, the like hormone mediated parenting behavior. And so they speculate that there's this additional like requirement, probably something to do with chromatin availability. So like there's some other set of genes or other pathways that also have to be available in order for these neurons to really be hormone sensitive to the hormones, and to initiate this behavior. So I think that's also another interesting thing that I hope will get followed up on. They take two different approaches to like figuring out what this estrogen and progesterone receptors do to these neurons in the medial preoptic area. And one is they have a transgenic animal where in all cells the estrogen and progesterone receptor can be removed by a Cre recombinase, which we've talked about before. So this is the Cre-Lox system. But typically when we have transgenic animals where we use Cre-Lox, we have the Cre also being expressed either everywhere if you want to knock out your Flox genes everywhere, or it's expressed only in a particular cell type. But genetics can be kind of leaky sometimes. So another way to do this, and one that doesn't involve breeding multiple transgenic lines together, is to essentially introduce the Cre recombinase expressed by a virus and just inject that virus into the area that you want to look at. So they had this animal where estrogen and progesterone receptors are available to be cleaved out of the DNA everywhere, but it's only going to be cleaved out of the DNA in the cells where the Cree virus was injected. So that's one way that they look at it. And that just demonstrates, and they show that just by doing that, you can wipe out this parenting behavior and the onset of parenting behavior even before the pups are born. But that doesn't tell us like which cells in the brain are involved. And they're going to need to know which cells in that part of the brain are involved, because they're going to do some functional studies, try to understand like how are these neurons acting. So the second approach they use is that they had identified that there's this protein called galanin. I hope I'm saying that right, but it's these galanin specific neurons that seem to be important for parenting behavior. So they want to specifically remove the estrogen and progesterone receptors only from the galanin expressing cells. So they do that with, again, using a virus, but slightly different construct. And the point is that if you remove estrogen and progesterone receptors from just those cells, just those galanin expressing neurons, then again, the parenting behavior is, you don't see it anymore. So it really says like this particular set of neurons is important in the medial preoptic area. And the experiments that they do after this, the takeaway message, you can break it into kind of two pieces. There's a kind of short-term, more plastic component, and then there's a more long-term remodeling component. So they found that the kind of short-term component, which reverses rapidly after birth, has to do with kind of tuning the neurons. So the estrogen receptor is, what it does is it, by modulating the channels that are expressed by the neurons that allow it to respond or not to incoming information, the estrogen kind of reduces the baseline activity of these galanin expressing neurons in the preoptic area. So they become silent. And they're not, but what's interesting is that they're silent until infant-related cues, pup-related cues are introduced, and then they fire really strongly. So this links back to what I mentioned earlier about in the human study, that there's this neural plasticity that's occurring during pregnancy is allowing the brain to kind of be like, none of this other stuff matters. What really matters is listening for your baby's cries. We know that pups have ultrasonic vocalization. So when they're removed, you pick them up and move them to another part of the cage, they start vocalizing. We can't hear it, but the mothers can't. And that, in addition to like the, chemical olfactory signals, helps the mother locate them and return them to the nest. So that's the estrogen dependent effects have to do with this kind of baseline kind of lowering of activity of these neurons, but then making them like really specific and very sensitive to particular cues. And you start seeing this already in mid-gestation. So even before the pups are there, these changes are happening. And I think that has something to do with the progesterone effects, which I guess I said earlier, lead to these kind of like more long-term remodeling of neural circuits and of like the structure of the neurons. So the progesterone acting through its receptor in these galanin expressing neurons in the medial preoptic area actually recruits more excitatory inputs and changes increases the number of dendritic spines on these cells. So it's allowing more of this information to come in. That probably has to do with the sensory processing that's required, to like hear or process those pup-related cues. But they say that remains TBD because they didn't look at that. But so what's really interesting is that they were able to separate these kind of two components of the neuroplasticity and say, like, this is estrogen dependent, this is progesterone dependent, which I think is really cool. And they actually show that if you delete one hormone receptor but not the other, you can exclusively get rid of whatever, the long-term component or the short-term component. And just like in humans, you have these neural changes that are lasting much longer than the early postpartum period. So when we breed mice, we leave the pups in the cage with their mother until they're about 21 days old. And at that point, they are old enough to be removed and placed in their own cages. So that's postnatal day 21. But the and the needs and the cues from the pups, are the needs of the pups and the cues that are coming from the pups, are also changing as they get older. But you're continuing to see these very early, or these changes in the female's brain started very early, continuing like very strongly and distinctly through this postnatal period. So that's another parallel between the what we observe in humans and what's happening in mice. So it's I'm trying to think if that might be all I wanted to cover. Yeah. So overall, it's really interesting to read this stuff as a pregnant person, and having and it, like I said before, it's kind of cool to think about how my brain volume may have changed and or is very likely changing. My head hasn't gotten smaller. My hair is really like looking more luscious, but that probably doesn't have anything to do with it.
I think it will be interesting to know. Like, clearly, there's a lot to figure out here, and there's going to be. It makes sense that there's like these acute changes that last during these periods, but then the question is, do they really reverse completely back to baseline, or are there long-term effects, or cumulative effects, as you say?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I also wonder. This is like reaching back to like some work that I did, when I was doing my rotations in graduate school, and I use quotations there because rotations, that you don't actually, I mean, if you get any work, like actual like data out of your rotation, your 3-month rotation, like, congrats, but that's not usually how it works. But in that, my first rotation in graduate school, the idea was to understand how certain subunits of NMDA receptors influence something called metaplasticity, which is like how plastic is this cell, can it do synaptic plasticity, essentially. And so I mentioned earlier that like there are in the, like, for example, in the mice, the medial preoptic area has cells that co-express these hormone receptors that are involved in the onset of parenting behavior, and then other cells that express these two receptors but are not engaged. And they're saying, maybe there are these epigenetic modifications. I don't think they use that word, but when we talk about like chromatin availability, epigenetics, the modification of the DNA gets pulled into the conversation. And I think it would be really interesting to look at whatever kind of substrates we already know about metaplasticity, how those might differ between the cell populations. And is that related to their sensitivity to reproductive hormones or not? But yeah, lots of questions. But I think, as I mentioned when we were talking before the show, I think this is part of like an increased interest in understanding how we are a sexed species. Males and females bodies do not work the same. We all kind of like know this, but we don't really like know this. So I see this as being this is kind of like a sub a subsection of that to understand how the pregnant body versus the
This is at least
non-pregnant
a
female body.
non-controversial aspect of, we know for sure that
Yes, exactly.
women get pregnant and men do
Yes.
not.
Yes. And like you said, non-controversial. There we also, I say we're a sexed species, but we also know that that's not black and white, and there's everything in between, you know. So um I in the book that I'm reading, it talks about how, or the author speculates that one of the reasons that there's been so much more research done on the male body and with rodents, for example, is just that researchers didn't have to you don't have to take into account estrus status or like how the hormones are changing. That's just,
Yeah, that's always been
and
the
that's fine.
reasoning.
Yeah. At least it illustrates that they were aware that those hormonal fluctuations were going to affect their outcomes. And so better to be like, this is what we're going to look at. We know that this is different. And now we're starting to dig into these questions about like, well, how does the cycle, the hormonal cycle, influence X, Y, and Z? But I think now there's going to be that extra. There's going to have to be that extra push to understand, like, well, with our understanding of what sex and gender identity, how that our understanding of those topics are changing. How is that going to
But
play
that's
out in
another
the
episode.
decades to come?
So
Yeah, I don't know. But how is that going to play out in the coming decades as we,
yeah,
start to dig into that stuff? So, but for now, like you said, non-controversial. If you are pregnant, you are biologically female.
So I wanted to make two comments here. First was in one of these papers, I don't remember which one, they made the statement that whatever kind of study you're doing, no matter what it is, you always have to know the pregnancy status because it makes huge changes. And so that could affect what's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
Yeah.
I always say that most people ignore the virome in their
Mm-hmm.
studies, right? Everybody has a chronic infection of some kind. Most people ignore it, so you don't know what's that. But also pregnancy can make a big contribution. But we try and
Yeah.
not have that factor in, but it may be a substantial factor in real world things. The second thing is they make this comment, which is really telling. So in the wild mice, virgin females will kill babies, right, that they encounter. And these
yeah,
hormonal changes are absolutely needed to reverse that behavior.
yeah.
So that is like the ultimate reason for this. But it begs the question of why infanticide would ever evolve like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that actually we see that in inbred strains too.
Yeah.
That bad moms will eat their pups. Not a good thing.
Yeah. There's also a social aspect of that, even in like non-human primates and in horses, for example. If there's social hierarchies to pay attention to, and the females may spontaneously abort the offspring if there's a change in the alpha male in their group.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating and does not happen in humans. I just want to make that very clear. We are very different in that sense.
Yeah. Well, also, I
Yeah.
used to notice that stressed females, they give birth and they're stressed, will eat their babies, right?
Yeah, or
So
if you introduce your hand,
Yeah,
if you get in there and you're like digging around in the nest, like
yeah.
a couple days, after those pups are born, you can be pretty sure you're going to come back and there's not going to be
Yeah.
any pups.
So we used to have construction going on in the mouse facility. It was very noisy, right? And the litters were always eaten. And we figured out that it was that noise that was bothering them, So
Yeah.
right.
it's hardwired. It's very interesting.
It is.
Lot to learn. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Vivian. That was great. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
That is TWiN 54. Show notes are at microbe.tv/TWiN. You can send us questions, comments, suggestions for things to talk about. TWiN at microbe.tv. If you enjoy these programs, we would love to have your financial support to continue them. Microbe.tv/contribute. Vivian, what's your official place now? Do you
Title
have-
now. Yeah, there was I've transitioned out of postdoctum. I'm a research scientist in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Tulane University, but
Okay.
I'm bringing my neuroscience expertise to my position. So it's a lot of project
Okay.
management.
Tulane University. Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you.
Jason Shepard's at the University of Utah. Jason Synaptic on Twitter. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Vincent. Thanks, Vivian. Yeah, fascinating topic.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at microbe.tv. You've been listening to This Week in Neuroscience. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next month.